What happens when the person you humiliate in public is the one secretly watching you? The sound of metal clicking shut echoed across the quiet street as Officer Daniel Brooks tightened the cuffs around Naomi Carter's wrists, his grip firm, his expression unmoved, like this was just another routine stop, just another face he had already judged before a single word was spoken. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and people slowed down, some pretending not to stare, others raising their phones just enough to capture what felt like another ordinary scene in a city that had seen too many of these moments before. But Naomi didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her breathing even, her eyes locked forward with a calm that didn't match the situation unfolding around her. And that alone made something feel off. Brooks glanced at her briefly, irritation flickering across his face as if her silence was an insult. "You're being detained," he said, his voice loud, authoritative, meant to carry, meant to establish control. But Naomi didn't ask why, didn't argue, and that only seemed to fuel him more as he turned slightly toward the growing crowd, reinforcing the narrative he had already decided was true. A car passed slowly, the driver craning their neck. Someone whispered, someone else shook their head, but no one stepped in, no one questioned it, because moments like this had become background noise. And yet, there was something different here, something subtle in the way Naomi's gaze shifted, not fearful, not defeated, but observant, like she was taking note of every detail, every word, every movement. Brooks reached for her bag, pulling it open with unnecessary force, scanning its contents quickly, dismissively, as if searching for justification rather than truth, and for a split second, something small caught the light inside, a metallic edge, a glimpse of something official. But he closed the bag just as quickly, uninterested, already convinced of what he believed. She was, across the street, unnoticed, a black SUV idled quietly, its tinted windows reflecting the scene like a mirror. No one realized they were standing in front of, and inside. A pair of eyes watched closely, unblinking. Naomi's wrists remained still in the cuffs, her shoulders relaxed despite the tension in the air, and when Brooks stepped back, satisfied with his control of the situation, he missed the one detail that mattered most. Not what she carried, not where she stood, but who she actually was. Because in that moment, while everyone else saw a woman being detained without cause, Naomi Carter was already calculating the next move, already waiting for the exact second when the truth would step into the light. And when it did, nothing about this street, this moment, or Officer Brooks' certainty would remain the same. The street did not move, but everything inside it shifted as Officer Brooks circled Naomi like he was trying to prove something not just to the crowd, but to himself, his jaw tight, his voice lower now yet sharper, asking questions he did not expect answers to. What are you doing in this area? Where are you coming from? Who are you meeting? And still Naomi said nothing, not because she could not respond, but because every second of silence was revealing more than words ever could. Imagine standing there, surrounded by strangers who already decided your story before you even spoke, feeling the weight of their eyes, the quiet judgment, the assumption that you must have done something wrong just to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Naomi did not carry that weight the way they expected. She carried something else entirely, something steady, controlled, almost patient. Brooks exhaled through his nose, frustrated, and stepped closer again, pulling his radio up to his shoulder as if to reinforce his authority. But when he spoke this time, his tone had changed slightly, less confident, more defensive, as though something he could not name had started to press against the edges of his certainty. Across the street, the black SUV engine cut off silently, the door opening just enough for a figure inside to step out slowly, unnoticed by most, but not by Naomi, whose eyes shifted for the briefest second before returning forward, her expression unchanged, her breathing still measured, as if everything was unfolding exactly on schedule. Brooks handed Naomi's bag to another officer who had just arrived, a younger one, hesitant, glancing between them as if unsure of what was really happening. "Check it again," Brooks said, louder than necessary, asserting control, but the younger officer paused for a moment too long, his eyes catching that same metallic edge inside the bag. Something official, something that did not match the story being told, and for A split second, doubt flickered across his face. Brooks noticed it immediately, his voice tightening. "You see something?" And the hesitation that followed was enough to change the air, enough to make the crowd lean in just slightly closer, enough to make the moment stretch longer than it should have. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, level, not raised, not rushed. "Officer, you are making a mistake." And the simplicity of it landed heavier than any protest could have, because it was not a plea. It was a statement, and Brooks felt it, even if he refused to admit it. His radio crackled again, louder this time, more urgent, a voice cutting through the static, repeating a name that made his grip tighten instinctively. "Confirm identity. Carter, repeat, Carter." And for the first time since this began, Brooks hesitated, just a fraction, just enough for the moment to crack open, just enough for reality to start catching up with assumption. The figure from the SUV stepped fully into view now, followed by another, both moving with purpose, not rushing, not reacting, but arriving, and Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the start, hands restrained, posture unshaken, eyes steady, because she had never been waiting for permission. She had been waiting for timing, and now, that timing was about to change everything. The moment stretched thin as the figures from the black SUV approached with a calm that did not match the tension in the air, their steps measured, deliberate, and somehow heavier than the noise of the entire street. And Officer Brooks felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle shift when control begins to slip without anyone saying a word. His radio was still in his hand, the static now quiet, but the name that had just come through echoed in his mind. Carter, repeated with a tone he had never heard directed at a routine stop, and he turned slightly, scanning the scene as if searching for confirmation that this was still his situation to command. The younger officer standing beside him held Naomi's bag a little differently now, not as evidence, but as something uncertain, his fingers loosening just enough to show hesitation. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Naomi stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, but now there was something else in it. Not defiance, not relief, but recognition, as if the pieces had finally aligned in real time. One of the approaching agents reached into his jacket, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with quiet authority, producing a badge that caught the late afternoon light just long enough for it to be seen by the right people. And in that instant, the energy of the street shifted completely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, phones lowered slightly, and the unspoken assumption that had filled the air began to collapse under its own weight. Brooks straightened instinctively, his shoulders tightening as he tried to regain footing, his voice firm but edged with something new. "What is this about?" he asked, not to Naomi, but to the approaching figure. But the answer did not come immediately, because it did not need to. The presence alone was enough to change the rules of the moment. The agent stepped closer, his eyes moving from Brooks to Naomi and back again, assessing, confirming, and then he spoke, calm, precise. "You need to release her." And the simplicity of the sentence carried more weight than any command Brooks had given all afternoon. For a brief second, Brooks did not move, caught between what he believed he knew and what was unfolding in front of him. And in that hesitation, the reality became undeniable. Naomi finally turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him directly. And for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, no observation, only clarity. "I told you," she said quietly, her voice steady. This was a mistake. And it was not said with anger, not said with satisfaction, but with the kind of certainty that does not need to prove itself. The younger officer stepped forward without being told, his hands moving carefully, almost respectfully now, as he unlocked the cuffs, the sound softer this time, less like control and more like correction, and Naomi lowered her hands slowly, not rushed, not shaken, just free. Brooks took a step back, his mind racing to reconcile the moment, but the agents were already moving, one of them speaking into a device, relaying information that Brooks could not fully hear but understood enough to know this was no longer his scene, no longer his call. And as Naomi adjusted her sleeves, her composure untouched, the final shift settled into place, because this had never been about whether she belonged there. It had always been about whether he understood who he was dealing with. And now, standing in the silence that followed, That answer was impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but settles slowly, pressing down on everyone who had witnessed the moment unfold. And Officer Brooks felt it first in the way no one was looking at him the same way anymore. The authority he had carried just minutes ago no longer filled the space. It shrank, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: doubt. Not just from the crowd, but from within himself. Naomi stood still for a second longer after the cuffs were removed, her wrists free now, but her composure unchanged, as if the restraint had never defined her in the first place. And as she adjusted the sleeve of her jacket with a calm, deliberate motion, one of the agents stepped slightly to her side, not in front of her, not leading her, but aligning with her, a subtle detail that spoke louder than any introduction. Brooks watched it happen, his mind trying to catch up, his voice lower now, almost cautious. "Who are you?" he asked. But the question no longer carried authority, it carried uncertainty, and Naomi turned toward him fully this time, meeting his eyes without hesitation, without emotion, just clarity. "The person you should have identified before you acted," she replied, her tone even, not raised, not sharp, but final. The younger officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at Brooks as if waiting for direction that no longer seemed to exist, and the agent who had spoken earlier reached into his jacket again, this time holding the badge longer, allowing it to be seen clearly. Not just a flash of metal, but an identity, a position, a level of authority that reframed everything that had just happened, and Brooks' eyes followed it, the realization settling deeper with each passing second. Across the street, more vehicles had quietly arrived, unmarked, controlled, and the presence they brought was not chaotic, it was precise, coordinated, the kind of presence that does not react, it executes. Naomi took a small step forward, not away, not retreating, but reclaiming the space she had been denied just moments earlier, and as she did, the energy around her shifted again, this time not with tension, but with recognition, because now the truth was no longer hidden, it was standing in plain sight. "This area has been under observation," the agent said calmly, his voice directed at Brooks, but meant for everyone listening. "And your actions have just become part of that record." And the words did not come as a threat, they came as a statement of fact, the kind that cannot be undone. Brooks exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing against him. His earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet realization that this was no longer a moment he controlled. And as he looked around, at the agents, at the vehicles, at the crowd that had gone silent, he understood that the narrative had shifted completely. Naomi's gaze moved past him briefly, acknowledging the team that had stepped in without a word needing to be exchanged, and then she looked back, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding, as if she had seen this moment coming long before it ever happened. Because for her, this was never just about one officer or one street. It was about something larger, something already in motion long before Brooks ever made his decision, and now, standing at the center of it, he was no longer the one asking questions, he was the one being seen. The air did not return to normal after that moment. It stayed suspended, like the entire street was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and Naomi Carter did not rush to fill that silence. She let it sit, let it stretch, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to fully feel the weight of what they just witnessed. Officer Brooks stood there, no longer moving with certainty, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides, his eyes flickering between Naomi and the agents around her, trying to piece together how quickly everything had shifted, how a situation he believed he controlled had turned into something far beyond his reach. One of the agents stepped slightly forward, his presence calm but undeniable, holding a small device in his hand, not pointed, not aggressive, just active, recording, documenting, preserving every second that had led to this exact moment. And Brooks noticed it, his posture tightening instinctively as he realized that this was not just an interaction, it was evidence. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze moving briefly across the crowd, taking in the faces that had watched her be judged without question, and then she looked back at Brooks, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet steadiness that made it impossible to look away. "Do you understand what just happened?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled, not accusing, but clear, and the question lingered in the air longer than any command he had given earlier. Brooks opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, because for the first time, he did not have an immediate answer, not one that made sense anymore, not one that could justify what had already been done. The younger officer shifted again, glancing at Naomi with a different expression now, not suspicion, but something closer to respect, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and that shift, small as it was, marked a deeper change happening beneath the surface. The agent beside Naomi spoke quietly into his device, relaying information in a tone that carried no urgency, only precision. "Subject interaction confirmed, recording secured," and those words, simple as they were, closed a loop that Brooks did not even realize he had stepped into. Naomi adjusted her jacket once more, her movements unhurried, her presence fully reclaimed, and then she spoke again, not louder, not harsher, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. "This was not random," she said, her eyes steady on his, "and it was not isolated." And in that moment, the meaning behind her words began to settle, not just on Brooks, but on everyone within earshot. Across the street, another agent stepped out of the SUV, speaking quietly with someone on a secure line, while a second vehicle pulled up behind it, the operation expanding not with chaos, but with quiet coordination, like a system already in motion long before this street ever became part of it. Brooks looked around again, this time not searching for control, but for understanding, and what he saw was not a mistake being corrected. It was something being revealed, something that had been building beneath the surface, waiting for the exact moment to come into the light. Naomi held his gaze for one final second, long enough for the realization to fully land, and then she stepped slightly past him, not dismissing him, not avoiding him, but moving forward, because for her, this moment was not the end of anything. It was simply the point where the truth could no longer be ignored. And as the agents continued their quiet work around them, one thing became undeniable. This was never just about one decision on one street. It was about everything that decision represented, and now, that representation had been captured, documented, and set into motion. Naomi did not look back as she stepped forward, but the space behind her seemed to tighten, as if every movement she made pulled the truth further into the open, and Officer Brooks felt it in a way he could not explain, like the ground beneath his authority had shifted without warning, leaving him standing on something unfamiliar. The agents moved with quiet coordination now, not rushing, not reacting, but executing a process that had clearly been in place long before this moment ever began. One of them speaking calmly into a secure line, another documenting positions, times, interactions, each action precise, controlled, and undeniable. Imagine standing there, realizing that what you thought was a simple decision has just become part of something much larger, something already being watched, recorded, and evaluated long before you even knew it existed. And Brooks felt that realization settle in. Slowly, heavier with each passing second, the younger officer beside him finally spoke, his voice lower, uncertain. "Sir, we did not run her name." And the statement, simple as it was, landed with more weight than any accusation, because it exposed the one thing Brooks had relied on without question, assumption. Brooks exhaled slowly, his eyes following Naomi as she spoke quietly with one of the agents. Their conversation brief, efficient, as if they were continuing something that had only been interrupted, not started. And in that moment, he understood that she had never been out of place, he had been out of awareness. The crowd that had gathered began to shift, their whispers changing tone, no longer filled with suspicion, but with realization. Phones that had once recorded a scene of authority now captured something entirely different, a reversal, a moment where the narrative they expected had quietly collapsed. Naomi paused near the black SUV, turning slightly as one of the agents handed her a small folder, her name visible for a brief second in bold lettering, followed by a title that Brooks could not fully read from where he stood, but did not need to, because the presence around her had already confirmed everything. She opened the folder just enough to review its contents, then closed it again, her movements calm, unhurried, as if time had never been lost, only redirected. Brooks took a step forward, not in command, not in confrontation, but in something closer to hesitation, as if searching for a way to regain control of a situation that no longer belonged to him. If there has been a misunderstanding, he began, his voice measured, careful, but Naomi turned her head slightly before he could finish, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. There was no misunderstanding, she said, not louder, not sharper, just clear, and the finality of it left no space for interpretation. The agent beside her glanced briefly at Brooks, then back to Naomi, awaiting instruction that did not need to be spoken out loud, because everything had already been set into motion across the street. The vehicles remained still, the agents positioned with purpose, and the quiet hum of coordination continued without disruption, like a system that had simply revealed itself rather than activated. Naomi stepped closer to the SUV, her hand resting briefly on the door handle, and for a moment, she looked back at the street, at the officers, at the crowd, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a level of awareness that made the entire scene feel smaller in comparison, because this moment, as powerful as it was not the center of her work, it was just one piece of something much larger, something that had been unfolding long before Officer Brooks ever made his decision, and now, standing at the edge of that realization, he could finally see it, not as a mistake, but as a consequence already in motion. Naomi's hand rested on the SUV door for only a moment before she let it fall back to her side, not leaving yet, not rushing away, because the moment had not finished unfolding, and everyone there could feel it, that quiet pause before something deeper revealed itself. Officer Brooks remained where he was, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, his mind replaying every second that led to this point. Every assumption made without question, every decision made without verification, and now, standing in the aftermath, those decisions felt heavier than they had just minutes ago. The younger officer stepped back slightly, creating space without being told, his eyes moving between Naomi and Brooks, as if witnessing a lesson no one had prepared him for, and the agents around Naomi maintained their calm precision, not escalating, not reacting, just present, like a system that did not need to prove itself because its authority was already established. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought defined someone else has actually revealed something about you, something you cannot easily explain or undo. And Brooks felt that realization settle deeper with every passing second. Naomi turned fully now, stepping away from the SUV, not to leave, but to address the space she had been forced into, her voice steady, measured, carrying just enough to be heard without needing to rise. "You made a decision before you had information," she said, her eyes on Brooks, not accusing, not emotional, just clear, and the words landed in a way that no raised voice ever could. Brooks swallowed slightly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to meet hers. But this time there was no challenge in it, only the quiet recognition that the situation had shifted beyond his control. One of the agents moved closer to Naomi, handing her a small device, and she accepted it without looking down, as if she already knew what it contained. Her attention still focused on the moment in front of her, because this was not just about documentation, it was about understanding. The crowd had grown quieter now, the earlier whispers replaced by a stillness that felt almost intentional, as if everyone present knew they were witnessing something more than a routine stop, something that carried weight beyond the street they stood on. Naomi took a slow breath, then spoke again, her tone unchanged. "This was not just about me," she continued, her gaze briefly shifting to the younger officer, then back to Brooks. "It was about how quickly judgment replaces process." And the statement lingered, not directed at one person, but at the entire moment itself. Brooks nodded once, almost instinctively, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if something inside him had finally caught up with what had already been revealed. Across the street, one of the agents finished speaking into a secure line and gave a subtle signal, and the movement that followed was minimal but precise, a quiet indication that the next phase had already been set. Naomi glanced once more at the vehicles, then back at Brooks, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in her expression, not softness, not forgiveness, but something closer to finality, as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion. Because for her, this was never about confrontation, it was about clarity, and now that clarity had been established, there was nothing left to prove, only something left to understand. And as she stepped back toward the SUV once more, the silence that followed carried a different weight, not tension, but truth settling into place. The moment did not end when Naomi stepped back toward the SUV. It deepened, settling into something quieter, something more permanent, as if the street itself had shifted from a place of reaction to a place of realization, and Officer Brooks felt that shift in the way no one was waiting for his next move anymore. The authority he had carried into the situation no longer directed the outcome. It had been replaced by a process that did not need his input, only his presence, and that presence now felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. Naomi paused just before reaching the vehicle, her hand hovering briefly near the door again, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this was the point where everything became clear, not just to her, but to everyone watching. Imagine standing there and realizing that the moment you thought you controlled has now become something that will be reviewed, analyzed, and remembered, not for what you intended, but for what it revealed. And Brooks stood in that exact space, aware now that this was no longer about the stop, but about the pattern behind it. One of the agents stepped forward slightly, speaking in a calm, measured tone that carried just enough to be heard. All interactions have been logged and secured, and the words settled into the air with a finality that could not be undone, not challenged, not reframed. The younger officer looked down briefly, then back up, his expression thoughtful, as if he was seeing beyond the moment for the first time, recognizing that what had just happened was not just an incident, but an example, something that would be looked at again, something that would matter beyond this street. Naomi turned her head once more, her gaze moving across the scene slowly, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, and when her eyes returned to Brooks, there was no tension left in them, only clarity. "You acted on assumption," she said quietly, her voice steady. "And assumption does not hold up when the truth is present." And the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to ignore. Brooks nodded again, slower this time, not out of obligation, but because there was nothing else to do. No argument to make. No explanation that would change what had already been seen. And in that moment, the realization settled fully, not as a shock, but as a quiet understanding that would not fade quickly. Across the street, one of the vehicles began to pull away, not in urgency, but with purpose, the operation continuing beyond what was visible, beyond what could be understood in a single moment. And the agents around Naomi adjusted their positions slightly, preparing to move without disrupting the stillness that had taken hold. Naomi finally opened the SUV door, the motion smooth, unhurried, and as she did, she paused one last time, not to say more, not to add anything, but because nothing else needed to be said. Everything that mattered had already been revealed, not through confrontation, not through force, but through the simple exposure of truth against assumption. And as she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, the silence that remained was no longer heavy. It was resolved, leaving behind a moment that would not be forgotten, not because of how it started, but because of what it became. The SUV door closed with a quiet finality, and for a moment, it felt like the entire street exhaled. But the story did not end there, because what had just happened was not something that could be left behind with the sound of a closing door. Inside the vehicle, Naomi Carter sat composed, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but her eyes focused, already moving forward, already processing what came next. Because for her, this was never about a single moment. It was about the pattern behind it, the system that allowed it, and the evidence now captured. In full clarity, outside, Officer Brooks remained still, his reflection faintly visible in the darkened window of the SUV as it idled for just a second longer. And in that reflection, he saw something unfamiliar, not authority, not control, but consequence, quiet and unavoidable. Imagine standing there after everything shifts, realizing that the moment is over, but the impact is just beginning. And Brooks felt that realization settled deeper than anything that had come before. One of the agents stepped closer to him, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a presence that made it clear the conversation was no longer optional. "You will be contacted for a full report," the agent said evenly, his tone professional, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation, and Brooks nodded once, his response automatic, but his thoughts far from settled. The younger officer stood nearby, silent now, his earlier uncertainty replaced with something more reflective, as if he was replaying the situation in his mind, seeing it differently with each passing second, understanding how quickly things can change when assumption replaces procedure. The SUV engine started softly, barely audible, and as it began to pull away, Naomi did not look back, not because she did not care, but because there was nothing left in that moment that required her attention. Everything that needed to be seen had already been seen. Everything that needed to be recorded had already been secured. Across the street, the remaining vehicles adjusted their positions, some pulling out smoothly, others staying just long enough to complete their role, the operation continuing beyond what was visible, beyond what could be fully understood from the outside. Brooks watched the SUV disappear down the street, the distance growing with each passing second, and with it, the illusion that this had been a routine encounter faded completely, replaced by the undeniable truth that he had stepped into something far more significant without realizing it. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations quiet, thoughtful, no longer driven by curiosity, but by reflection, as if everyone present carried a piece of what had just unfolded with them. Brooks finally moved, not with urgency, not with purpose, but with the weight of understanding settling into his steps. And as he glanced once more at the space where Naomi had stood, the absence felt louder than her presence ever had, because it marked the exact point where everything had changed, somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of that street, beyond the view of those who had watched. Naomi Carter was already continuing forward, her work uninterrupted, her purpose unchanged, and the question that lingered in the silence she left behind was not what had just happened, but what would come next now that the truth had been seen, documented, and set into motion. The city moved on, but for Officer Brooks, time did not return to normal. It slowed, stretched, replayed itself in fragments that refused to settle. Because some moments do not end when the scene clears, they follow you, quietly, persistently, asking questions you were not ready to answer. Later that evening, under the cold fluorescent lights of the precinct, Brooks sat at his desk, the usual noise of phones and distant conversations blending into a low hum. But none of it reached him the same way, because his focus was fixed on something far more unsettling. The report form in front of him, blank, waiting, demanding more than just a routine explanation. Imagine trying to explain a decision that no longer makes sense even to you, trying to put into words something that shifted the moment you understood it, and Brooks felt that weight in every second he hesitated, pen in hand, unable to begin. Across the room, the younger officer stood near the break area, speaking quietly with another colleague, their voices low but serious, no longer casual, no longer dismissive, because what they had witnessed had changed the way they saw the job, even if they did not say it directly. Brooks glanced up briefly, catching fragments of their conversation, words like procedure, verification, protocol, and each one landed differently now, no longer abstract, no longer routine, but real, immediate, tied to something that had just unfolded hours earlier. His radio sat silent on the desk beside him, but he could still hear that moment in his mind, the voice repeating the name, the shift in tone, the instant when certainty gave way to doubt, and he realized that was the exact point everything began to unravel. The door to the precinct opened quietly, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence calm but deliberate, moving with the same measured control Brooks had seen earlier that day, and without needing to ask, Brooks already knew why he was there. The room shifted subtly, conversations lowering, attention redirecting, not because of authority displayed, but because of authority understood. The man approached the desk without urgency, placing a thin folder down in front of Brooks, not pushing it forward, not emphasizing it, just placing it there. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Brooks looked at the folder, then up at the man, and the silence between them carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it was not about accusation, it was about accountability. You will need to complete that report accurately. The man said finally, his voice calm, measured, not harsh, not raised, but firm in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Brooks nodded once, slowly, understanding that this was no longer just paperwork. It was a record, something that would be reviewed, examined, remembered. The man turned to leave without waiting for a response, his presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, and the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But Brooks remained still, his attention fixed on the folder now in front of him. He opened it carefully, the pages inside filled with timestamps, notes, captured details from the scene, each line precise, each moment preserved exactly as it had happened. And as he read, the gap between what he believed and what was documented became impossible to ignore, because this was not just about what he had done. It was about what had been seen, recorded, and now understood. And as he finally lowered his pen to the paper, one thing became clear. The moment on that street was not over. It had simply moved to a place where it could no longer be overlooked. The pen did not move right away, and in that stillness, Officer Brooks realized something he had never considered before, that writing the truth felt heavier than speaking assumptions ever had, because this time, every word would remain, every detail would matter, and there would be no room to reshape what had already been seen. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the report in front of him, and as he stared at the first blank line, he understood that this was not just about documenting an event, it was about confronting it. Imagine sitting there, knowing that what you write will be read by people who were not there, people who will only see the facts, stripped of tone, stripped of intention, reduced to what actually happened, and Brooks felt the weight of that clarity pressing against him. Across the precinct, the usual rhythm continued, phones ringing, footsteps echoing, voices rising and falling, but to him, it all sounded distant, like the world had moved forward while he remained fixed in a moment that refused to fade. He finally lowered the pen and began to write, slowly at first, each word deliberate, each sentence careful, because now he could not rely on instinct. He had to rely on accuracy, and the difference between the two had never been more clear. As he wrote, the memory replayed itself again. Naomi standing calm, the agents arriving without urgency, the shift in tone over the radio, and the moment his certainty had begun to fracture, not because someone challenged him, but because something undeniable had entered the situation. The door to the precinct opened again, and this time, a different presence stepped inside, not loud, not commanding, but focused, and as Brooks glanced up, he recognized her immediately. Naomi Carter, standing just inside the doorway, her posture the same, her composure unchanged, as if the earlier moment had not disrupted her path at all. Conversations in the room lowered instinctively, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because her presence carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to be announced. She walked forward at a steady pace, her eyes moving briefly across the room before settling on Brooks, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be understood had already been established. Imagine facing someone again after a moment like that, not in conflict, not in confrontation, but in clarity, knowing that the truth now exists between you without needing to be explained. Naomi stepped closer to the desk, her voice calm when she finally spoke. I am here to ensure the report reflects what actually happened, and the statement was not a demand, not a challenge, but a standard, one that did not bend to perception or assumption. Brooks nodded slowly, his grip on the pen steadying as he looked down at the page again. And in that moment, something shifted inside him, not a sudden change, not a dramatic realization, but a quiet acceptance that this process, this documentation, was part of something larger than him, something that required more than instinct, more than habit. Naomi remained standing beside the desk, not watching over him, not supervising, but present, a reminder that the truth was not something to be shaped. It was something to be recorded, and as Brooks continued to write, the gap between who he thought he was in that moment and who he needed to be became impossible to ignore, because this time, the story would not be told from his perspective, it would be told from the truth itself. The room felt different now, not because anything had visibly changed, but but because the weight of what was being written had begun to settle into every corner of the space, and Officer Brooks could feel it with each line he added to the report, each sentence pulling him further away from assumption and closer to something far more difficult: accuracy. Naomi Carter remained beside the desk, not interrupting, not guiding, simply present, her silence carrying a quiet expectation that did not need to be spoken out loud, because the standard had already been set. Imagine writing something you cannot take back, knowing that every word becomes part of a record that will outlast the moment, that will be read without your voice, without your tone, without your intention. And Brooks felt that reality in the way his hand moved slower, more deliberate, as if each word had to pass through a level of truth he had never fully considered before. The sounds of the precinct continued around them. Distant conversations, the occasional ring of a phone, the shuffle of papers, but none of it interrupted the focus at the desk, because this moment had narrowed into something precise, something that demanded attention without distraction. Brooks paused for a second, his eyes scanning what he had written so far, and in that pause, he saw the difference. Clearly, not just in the words, but in the perspective, the absence of assumption, the presence of detail, the shift from instinct to fact. And it was unfamiliar, but it was necessary. Naomi glanced briefly at the page, not reading over his shoulder, not correcting, just acknowledging that the process was happening, and that alone seemed to steady the room, because it was not about control, it was about alignment. Brooks continued writing, noting the timeline, the location, the interaction, each part placed in order, each moment described as it occurred. And as he did, the memory no longer replayed as something he justified. It replayed as something he understood, and that understanding carried a different kind of weight. "You are not writing what you thought happened," Naomi said quietly after a moment, her voice calm, measured. "You are writing what did happen." And the distinction, simple as it was, settled into the space like a final piece of clarity, something that could not be ignored once it was recognized. Brooks nodded slightly, his eyes still on the page, and for the first time since he had picked up the pen, his hand did not hesitate, because the path forward had become clear, not easier, but clearer. Across the room, the younger officer watched from a distance, his posture still, his expression thoughtful, as if he was witnessing something that extended beyond the moment, something that would shape how he approached his own decisions in the future. And that silent observation added another layer to what was unfolding, because this was no longer just about one report, it was about what that report represented. Naomi stepped back slightly, giving space without removing her presence, allowing the process to continue without interruption. And as Brooks reached the final lines, the room seemed to hold a quiet stillness again, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, because this was the point where the moment transitioned from experience to record. Brooks placed the final period on the page, his hand still for a second longer than necessary, and then he set the pen down, not with relief, not with finality, but with the understanding that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of accountability, something that would move forward from this desk into places he could not control, places where the truth would stand on its own. Naomi looked at the completed report for a brief moment, then back at Brooks, her expression unchanged, her voice calm as she spoke one final time. "This is where it begins to matter." And as those words settled into the space between them, the moment shifted once more, not with noise, not with movement, but with the quiet realization that the story had now entered a phase where it could no longer be shaped, only faced. The silence after Naomi's words did not feel empty. It felt complete, like something had finally settled into place, something that had been building long before this day ever began. And Officer Brooks sat there for a moment longer, looking at the report in front of him, not as a document to be filed, but as a reflection he could not ignore. Imagine realizing that the moment you thought defined someone else has instead redefined you, not through force, not through confrontation, but through truth that simply refused to bend. And Brooks felt that realization settle in a way that would not fade with time. Naomi Carter did not linger. She did not need to, because everything that mattered had already been said. And as she turned to leave, her presence moved through the precinct with the same quiet authority it had carried from the beginning, steady, composed, undeniable. and the room seemed to adjust around her without anyone needing to acknowledge it. The younger officer watched her pass, his expression thoughtful, as if he understood that what he had witnessed was not just an isolated moment, but a lesson that would follow him into every decision he made moving forward. And that understanding, quiet as it was, marked a shift that could not be undone. Brooks finally stood, the chair behind him moving slightly, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness. And for the first time since the moment on the street, he was not reacting, not defending, but thinking, truly thinking about what had happened, what it meant, and what it revealed. Across the room, the door closed softly behind Naomi, and with it, the visible presence of the moment faded, but the impact remained, settling into the space like something permanent, something that would not be forgotten simply because the scene had ended. Brooks looked down at the report one last time, his own words staring back at him, not shaped by assumption, not softened by interpretation, but grounded in what had actually occurred. And in that clarity, there was no room left for denial, only understanding. He placed the report into the folder carefully, not rushed, not careless, as if the act itself carried meaning now. Because it did, it marked the point where the moment became part of something larger, something that extended beyond him, beyond that street, beyond that single decision. Imagine a system where every action is eventually seen, where every assumption is eventually tested, and every truth, no matter how quiet, finds its way to the surface. And in that system, the badge does not define the law, the truth does. Brooks exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acceptance, because this was not about punishment. It was about awareness, the kind that changes how you move, how you decide, how you see. Outside, the city continued as it always had, people moving, lights changing, life unfolding without pause. But somewhere within that movement, a line had been drawn, not visible, not loud, but real. Naomi Carter walked forward into that same city, her role unchanged, her purpose steady, because she had never needed to prove who she was, only to let the truth reveal itself at the right moment. And for Officer Brooks, standing in the quiet aftermath, one thing had become impossible to ignore. He thought he was enforcing the law, but that day, the law had been watching him.